Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. James Rachels, in his classic analysis, The Challenges of Cultural Relativism, sets out and isolates 5 sets of claims that he takes to be really at the heart of any formulation of cultural relativism. And he reviews quite a few of them, some coming from anthropologists, some coming from our general Western culture in late modernity. And each of these he sets out so that we can look at them in turn and see whether they're actually plausible. So first, let's see what each of them is, and then talk a little bit about their implications, what the meaning of them would be, Rachel's own viewpoint on their interdependence or contradiction, and then some of the rejoinders or qualifications that he thinks are important to set out in this piece. So the first is quite simple. Different societies have different moral codes. The second, the moral code of a society determines what is right in that society. He actually adds a little bit to that. That is, if the moral code of a society says a certain action is right, that action is right, at least within that society. The third is, there is no objective standard that can be used to judge one society's code as better than another's. There's no moral truths that hold for all people at all time. The fourth, the moral code of our own society has no special status. It is but one among many. Then fifth and finally, it is arrogant for us to judge other cultures. We should always be tolerant of them. So now let's look at each of these a little bit more closely. Different societies have different moral codes. This is supposed to be not so much a normative statement, but a descriptive statement telling us about how judgments and evaluations are made about moral matters within those societies. And Rachel's gives you several now classic examples, one from Herodotus, where the Greeks are told that, somebody's proposing for them to eat their dead, and another group of people are told that the proposal is that they should burn their dead, and both of them recoil in horror from what the other group supposedly do. And this is supposed to demonstrate to us that there are different customs, different deeply felt and held beliefs and sentiments about what's right and wrong. And this is quite true. Even within the same society, we often have incredible variance among moral judgments, don't we? Even people within the same culture disagree about what is right and wrong. The second one, the moral code of a society, determines what is right in that society. This is a somewhat stronger claim. If we're understanding it merely in a descriptive way, then we could say the moral code of a society determines for the members of the society or other people within that society trying to take part in it what counts as right or wrong. But this is going a little bit further. It's saying right and wrong is actually determined as such by what society that you're in. And it's sort of like, Pascal's observation that on this side of the Pyrenees, this is true, and on this side of the Pyrenees, this is false. Different sides of the Pyrenees, of course, being France and Spain. The third one, There is no objective standard to judge one society's code as better than another, with the implication that there are no moral truths that hold for all people at all times. Again, a very strong claim. There's no way to say that one code or even one portion of a code, say perhaps the parts that have to do with how to bury or not bury or dispose of or not dispose of the dead, or how long one should remain in mourning and what one ought to wear, or whether one ought to be married and what marriage is going to look like. Those would all be parts of codes. And then we could talk about the totality of a culture's code as well. This is saying we cannot judge any of them in relation to each other. It doesn't mean that you can't judge within a particular society that there would be better and worse ways of doing things, but that would fall into the number 2 category, wouldn't it? You're already within that society at that point. The 4th is very interesting. This one is not going to apply to all societies, but to modern, Western, industrialized, liberal, democratic, whatever qualifications we want to place on it, our society. We should not try to say that our moral code has any sort of special status. It is merely one among many different possibilities, no better, no worse than any of them. Presumably, the moral code that we have today is no better than the one that we had within our society, say, in 1950 or 1850 or 1750 as well. So that would be a bit of an implication of that. And then finally, probably the strongest claim of all, number 5, it is arrogant to judge other cultures. We should instead take an attitude of tolerance towards all of them. This is what the cultural relativist is telling us as, again, members of modern, liberal, Western, democratic, industrial, or post-industrial, whatever we are, society. The cultural relativist is typically not saying this to everybody else, although perhaps he or she is thinking it in their mind, in their heart, as they approach other cultures, which do not, in fact, value tolerance to the degree that we do, or at least claim to. Now, it's quite interesting. Rachel points out that these 5 propositions may seem to go together, but they're actually independent of one another. So you could, in fact, believe number 1 without believing number 5, or you could, in fact, believe number 3 without believing number 2. You could have any of these together in a combination. You don't actually have to have all 5. Although, he also points out there does appear to be a bit of a contradiction between some of them as well. And he gives the example, the 2nd says right and wrong are determined by the norms of a society. The 5th says one should always be tolerant of other cultures. But what do? He says, in the case of a society whose norms include intolerance. And the example that he has, quite interestingly, has to do with Nazi Germany invading Poland. Now think this through. He says that when the Nazi army invaded Poland, beginning World War II, this was an intolerant act of the first order, but what if it conformed to Nazi ideals? You could say, well, at the core of Nazism was this view that races have to struggle against each other. This is a good thing. Who are we to condemn the Nazis? Who were even the Polish people who were being invaded to condemn the Nazis coming in? Rachel has another interesting twist to this, though. He says, well, once they cross that border into Polish society, wouldn't they be bound by the norms of Polish society rather than their Nazi ideology? I mean, they are, in a way, sort of like resident aliens, albeit within a military organization. And so shouldn't they have given up their Nazism at the border? This is kind of an ingenious way of talking about this. And you notice that there are some internal, at least tensions, if not contradictions, between some of these as well, as Rachel is pointing out. Now, towards the end of his essay, Rachels also says we need to take each of these and think about the extent to which they are actually true or correct or valid. What qualifications would we need to make in order to hold on to these claims? Different societies have different moral codes. That is unmistakably true. There are different moral codes. Again, I've pointed out, even within the same society, subcultures often vary from each other and individuals vary from each other. However, Rachels points out, this doesn't mean that the codes are entirely different from each other. As a matter of fact, if you think about certain basic human functions, like, say, regulating sexuality or regulating killing, every society, every perspective that takes a moral stand says it's okay to kill in this case, but not in this case. And they vary about what those cases are, how to draw the lines, but they do recognize you can't just kill anybody at any time, or take whatever you want, or sleep with whoever you want. So there are some shared norms of some sort. Number two is a little bit weaker. The moral code of a society determines what is right in that society. Rachels points out that when we assert that, we're forgetting a fundamental distinction, the distinction that every society pretty much recognizes within its language and its logic, the distinction between believing something to be the case and actually being correct about that being the case, because that is true. So it's quite possible that societies could in fact be mistaken about whether something is the good thing to do or the right thing to do, or whether it's the wrong thing to do. If not, there would be no possibility of a society actually deciding to change its norms from within, or social conflict over whether things are right or wrong. The third one, no objective standard to judge one society's code is better than any other. Rachel says, well, if that's the case, we're in real trouble, because that means that we're not going to be able to condemn or even judge or probably even successfully analyze certain cultural practices that are widely recognized as wrong. And he uses the example of female circumcision as a prime case. We could also think of genocide as another case. And what Rachel suggests to us is, if we're going to be able to say that some things are wrong, it is important that we're not just saying, well, they're wrong because they don't fit the American way or something like that. We're going to need some, what he calls, principles that are not tethered to particular societies. We're going to need something more like, say, general moral principles of a utilitarian or a Kantian or some other kind, or a conception of moral rights or even human rights. And then, there can be some argument, as people have made, that those are Western conceptions. But, the West is a little bit broader than just a single particular culture, isn't it? It's kind of got an interesting quasi-status as something at least potentially universal. We can put that aside for the moment. Let's look at number 4. So if we say that the moral code of our society has no special status and that there are many different ways of living, all of them equally valid, then does that actually mean that they're all equally good? It doesn't seem that we have to say that they're all automatically on exactly the same level. And then finally, with the 5th one, it's arrogant to judge other cultures. We should be tolerant of them. And Rachels wants to say it simply is not going to work to be tolerant of everything. And he says there's much truth in this. The point is overstated. We are often arrogant when we criticize other cultures, and tolerance is generally a good thing. But we shouldn't tolerate everything. And he says if we want to actually make any progress as human societies, or if we want to honor the progress that has been made, then we have to say that not everything can be tolerated, and a general, across-the-board attitude of tolerance is not actually morally appropriate. So, these are the 5 claims that Rachel's takes as being central to most typical portrayals of cultural relativism. And I think he's actually quite correct about that. And then we can see how each of these has to be qualified if we want to hold on to those claims.